This class on the use of Ellen White's writings and the value of her writings is very needed today, because in a place like this, we teach quite a few reforms, and if your confidence is not totally solid, then you're going to question those reforms, and you're going to think that we're fanatical or, going too far with these things. But if what you read, you believe is true, then you will be able to accept those reforms. And it's kind of interesting to me that people feel that Ellen White wrote so long ago that some of it is no longer valid. Well, what about the Bible writers? They wrote 2,000 years ago, the latest ones, and some wrote, 4,000 years ago. And if the writings of the last prophet have to be altered, what about them? And then, of course, that leads to the idea, well, maybe there's a different kind of inspiration that Ellen White had from what the Bible writers had, and it leads to all kinds of justifications for a philosophy that I don't believe is solid. And so I'm going to give you the reasons why I believe it 100%. Now, I didn't think to get a bunch of these made beforehand, but there's a syllabus that I have, and we can probably get more if there are more that want it. I have 5. This syllabus has everything that I will share with you, plus more that I won't have time to share. And if you're interested, it's $275, and you can purchase that for your further study. We're going to start off with where most classes, even in universities, Adventist universities, start, if they have the class, the biblical tests of a prophet. In 1 John 4:1, we're told that we should test any new prophet that comes along. We should test them. Beloved, believe not every spirit, but try the spirits, whether they are of God, because many false prophets are gone out into the world. So when it says try the spirits, it's talking about the manifestation of the Spirit through a prophet that we are supposed to test and see whether they're true or false. Now, if they are true, God doesn't give us the right to test what they say and follow some and not follow others. But He does ask us and give us the responsibility to see if they're a true prophet or not. So it's not wrong to test Ellen White. And also in 2 Peter 2:1, it says, but there were false prophets also among the people, even as there shall be false teachers among you. So in today's world, very few people call themselves prophets. It's more popular to call himself a teacher, but in the Old Testament times, the distinction between the two is really not there. A prophet was a teacher. And so they may call themselves a teacher, but if they are teaching things that don't agree with the Bible, then we can't accept them as a true teacher. It says, who privily shall bring in damnable heresies, even denying the Lord that bought them, and bring upon themselves swift destruction. So we can expect false prophets, false teachers in the last days, and that's the reason we really do need to test. So it wouldn't be wrong for you to test Ellen White, since she's the last one, to test her as well as any other people that come along claiming to have a special message for us. So we're going to look at 4 major tests. Isaiah 8:20, to the law. When it says law here, it's talking about the books of Moses. To the law and to the testimony. The testimony is all the rest of the Bible. If they speak not according to this word, it is because there is no light in them. Now, at the time this was written, we only had up to the prophets that were sharing before Isaiah. But the same principle would go all the way through the rest of the prophets after Isaiah and into the New Testament. Many don't stop to think about it, but the New Testament could not be put in the Bible if it disagreed with the Old Testament, because you have to test everything that comes along by what you had from before. And that means that the Sabbath hasn't changed. If it did, then there would be a conflict between what the Old Testament says is the Sabbath and the New Testament says is the Sabbath. And it leads to other issues as well. So basically, if you want to think about how was the Bible put together, it started with an evaluation of the writings of Moses, and it was generally accepted that the writings of Moses were inspired, that indeed he was given those messages by God. And so when the next prophet came along, it had to be compared with the books of Moses, and if it agreed with them, it could be added to the Bible, and so on. And therefore, when we come to Ellen White, we don't add her to the Bible because your Bible would be too big anyway. But we do test her by the Bible to see if she's a true prophet or not. Now that takes a while to do adequately. So I'm going to read a testimony by one of our pioneers, S.N. Haskell. And this is found in the 4th volume of the biography of Ellen White, page 68. I happened to be born in the East and embraced the truth there, and so have battled in this line. He's talking about discussing with people the fact that Ellen White was a prophet. He says, I battled in this line a good deal. Nothing pleased me more than to get those who oppose the visions together and have a Bible reading on the testimonies. So there was a lot of doubt in Ellen White's day in regard to whether she was a prophet or not. And so as he traveled around, he would be happy if somebody wanted to question. And then he would study with them the answer to their questions. And before we began, we always made this statement, that if they could find any line in the testimonies that pertained to a doctrine that I could not establish from the Bible, I would give up the testimonies. There I will stand today, so I believe the testimonies. This was written later in his life after he'd been doing this for a long time, and many people had brought up what they thought was a conflict between her writings in the Bible, and he could always show them there was no conflict. Now, of course, there is additional information. That's the purpose of, all the details were not written in the books of Moses. So as the Bible unfolds, we have other details that are revealed, but they do not conflict with what was written before. And so the same with Ellen White's writings as we test them, that if we find something that conflicts, then that would be a dangerous signal. And it can't be even one thing. That, a prophet has to be able to measure up 100%. Now, there might be some things difficult for you to reconcile, but if there's enough study, you will be able to reconcile it. That's the way he found it anyway. And I would throw out the same challenge. If you think you have seen some conflict between Ellen White's writings and the Bible, let me know. And some I've already heard. If I haven't heard it, I'll look into it for you. But I've been doing this for almost 50 years now, and nobody's been able to bring up a conflict that I couldn't resolve satisfactorily in my mind. One time I was studying with a Church of Christ, former Church of Christ individual, and she had a friend that was a Seventh-day Baptist. The Seventh-day Baptists split off from the Adventists partly because they wouldn't accept the writings of Ellen White. And so when this friend saw that she was leaning toward becoming an Adventist, he gave her a document with 100 supposed discrepancies between Ellen White's writings and the Bible. And so I thought, well, I better look at this and give her some feedback on this document. So I started studying. Well, before I finished, she became an Adventist, so I didn't finish the list. But I did about 20 of them. And what I discovered was that sometimes they didn't understand the Bible, what the Bible was saying, and so they thought that she conflicted with the Bible. But a correct understanding of the Bible agrees with what she said. Other times, they misunderstood what she said, as well as misunderstanding what the Bible said. And so, there was no real conflict if you understand both. And, basically we have to look at things in the context. We can't just reach in and grab something because it may sound bad when you do that. There are some texts in the Bible that sound like you go to heaven when you die, if you just reach in and grab it. But if you look at what came before and what comes after, you see, oh, he wasn't really talking about that. And we can clear up most difficulties by simply reading in advance of the quote and go on afterward, and that clears up a lot. So for my satisfaction, I saw no conflict in any of those 20, and I would guess that if I studied all 100, I would find the same thing. So you have testimony of people that have gone before you, and you can test it out over time so that you can say, not because they did, but because you have tested also. The second test in the Bible is found in Jeremiah 28:9. The prophet which prophesieth of peace, when the word of the prophet shall come to pass, then shall the prophet be known that the Lord hath truly sent him. Now, if you understand the book of Jeremiah, there were all these false prophets that were prophesying peace for Jerusalem, and Jeremiah was the only one saying, you better surrender to the king of Babylon, because if you don't, your city's going to get wiped out. And so, of course, the people liked the message of the other prophets better. And he had a big struggle to try to convince people. And he finally said, okay, let's wait and see what happens. If those prophets that are prophesying peace are right, then what I've told you won't take place. Well, we know that Jeremiah was right, and the people learned the hard way that he was the true prophet. Also in Deuteronomy 18:22, it says, when a prophet speaketh in the name of the Lord, if the thing follow not, nor come to pass, that is the thing which the Lord hath not spoken. But the prophet hath spoken it presumptuously. Thou shalt not be afraid of him. So if there's anything the prophet predicts that doesn't come to pass, then they're a false prophet. And even if they had 80% of their prophecies come to pass, or even 95%, but 5% was wrong, then they're not a true prophet. So this test also can be applied to any of the prophets. I'll just give you a couple of predictions that Ellen White made. She is not primarily prophesying future events, but the Lord gave her enough so that we can test her on this. And here was one of the very early ones. There's a book called The Spirit of Prophecy Treasure Chest. Unfortunately, it's out of print right now, but it was made by the White Estate for the Voice of Prophecy back when the Voice of Prophecy offered a class on Ellen White. And they quit offering it. We bought out their inventory of treasure chest books, but we sold them all. We made one of our own. We asked for permission to type it up ourselves. And then somewhere somebody disposed of it, and I can't find it anywhere at Wildwood. It's a big job to do it over again, but someday I hope to be able to do that. It's a wonderful resource for information on her writings. Here's a quote from it. Elder J. N. Loughborough, early in the work, gives us an account of what took place at Oswego, New York, in the winter of 1849 to 50. While Elder and Mrs. White were there laboring for souls, a revival was started in one of the Protestant churches by a layman who was county treasurer. That's what they always do, If we have evangelistic meetings, they start a revival to try to keep their people from coming to the Adventist meetings. This man professed to have a great burden for the unconverted. A young man, Hiram Patch, and his fiancée were in the balance as to whether to cast their lot with the revival. So she's going to tell us something about, or tell Hiram Patch something, or join with the Sabbath-keeping Adventist. In vision, Ellen White was shown the true character of the man conducting the revival. And as she spoke of it to Mr. Patch, she told him she was instructed to tell him, "Wait a month, and you will know for yourself the character of the persons who are engaged in this revival." Now, if during that month information does not come out to prove that the Adventists are more trustworthy, then she's going to be a false prophet. And who profess to have such a great burden for sinners, Mr. Patch replied, "I will wait." So he decided to wait a month and see what evidence would come out. Within a fortnight, that's 2 weeks, we don't usually use that anymore in this country. Within a fortnight, the treasurer revivalist, in his affected agony for sinners, burst a blood vessel in his stomach and was confined to his bed at home. When others took over the treasurer's work at the county office, a shortage of $1,000 in county funds was immediately found. Would you be willing to trust a speaker who is embezzled. Now, if we brought this up to today, it'd probably be more like 20,000 or 50,000 that he had embezzled. An inquiry made by the sheriff brought only solemn denials from the treasurer of any knowledge of the missing money. So not only was he an embezzler, he was a liar. Until another officer observed the treasurer's wife hastily hide something in a snowbank and found the bag containing the money and confronted the embezzling treasurer with the evidence. So Hiram Patch had no trouble 2 weeks later deciding, I'm not going to go with them. I'm going to go with the Adventists. And so this was a prophecy that we can use to test the truthfulness of Ellen White's messages. What it really boils down to is if the individual has hatched up the message themselves, they're going to have a margin of error. Even if they listen to Satan and he gives them their message, they're going to have a margin of error. And it's pretty big. One time I got a series of tapes that were explaining the fallacy of water dowsing, or the more accurate name is water witching, because there are some Adventists that use that method to find a place to drill a well. And this one man, his son wanted to do that, and he thought, well, I don't know, it doesn't seem to me like that's a proper way to find water. So he called up the General Conference and he asked them, what's our Adventist position on water dowsing? And I don't know who he got there at the GC, but they told him, well, we think it's some scientific principle we don't understand yet. And that didn't satisfy him, so he called up the Jehovah's Witness, and they said, it's of the devil. So he decided, I better help my Adventist brethren and do some research on this. He was led to England, where the headquarters of this practice are. He went to some of their meetings, and they freely admit it's of the devil. And he witnessed some really strange things that instrument could do to people. And he saw very clearly. And so they were passing these tapes out in our conference to all the pastors. And I got a copy of those tapes. It was very informative. But what it boils down to is that the devil can guess correctly only about 25% of the time, from 10 to 25%. So those that are getting their information from the devil have to keep changing and giving explanations why the prophecy didn't work out. And, they're doing this all the time. They're saying, well, there's going to be an earthquake in San Francisco on such and such a date. And the date passes and there's no earthquake. So then they have to come up with an explanation why it didn't happen, and they give another prophecy. But when we see that, we need to turn away. They're not getting their message from God. God sees the future just as well as the past, better than we can see the past. He sees everything perfectly. When he tells one of his prophets something is going to happen, you can be guaranteed it's going to happen at the time he said it would. Needless to say, the revival collapsed, and Hiram Patch and his affianced, with the words of prediction still fresh in their ears, became fruitful members of the remnant church. Here's another prediction that Ellen White made. This was in the Parkville Church, and if you go to Battle Creek, they have a replica of the Parkville Adventist Church. It was a joyous occasion for the Parkville Seventh-day Adventist Church. Several of the leading workers were present to assist in dedicating this new house of worship to the service of God. In connection with the afternoon meeting, Ellen White, who had been speaking, was taken in vision. This was Sabbath, January 12, 1861. 3 weeks earlier, South Carolina had seceded from the Union. 3 other states had followed, one each on Wednesday, January 9, Thursday, January 10, and Friday, January 11. Of the action of these last 3 states, the believers at Parkville may or may not have known. However, here's the key point. No one expected actual war. So even though they were aware of some of those facts, nobody expected civil war to break out in the U.S. And it was not until a full 3 months later that President Lincoln called for an army. But a deep impression was made upon those in the little church as Ellen White, coming out of vision, told the audience that a number of states would join South Carolina in secession and that the nation was on the brink of war. So if the Civil War doesn't happen, she's a false prophet. She described views of armies in conflict with terrible carnage by bullet and bayonet. She saw battlefields covered with the dead and dying. Now, some of you have probably read some about the Civil War. It was a very brutal war. I suppose all civil wars are. But the amount of death was really a horrible situation. And sometimes there were families split, fighting on both sides against each other. She described scenes of suffering in overcrowded prisons. And she saw homes where distress and anguish reigned because of the loss of husbands, sons, or brothers. Then, looking around, she said solemnly and sadly, in words which startled the audience, "There are those in this house who will lose sons in that war." Now, here's a very specific prediction, and if some of the people that are members of that church don't die in the war, she's a false prophet. In a few months, the dreadful war was in progress. For 4 sad years, it dragged on. Newspaper accounts brought ever new and convincing evidence of the accuracy of the prediction in the Parkville church. No less than 5 families in the room that day lost sons in the carnage. So, again, we see that the prediction, which was made quite some period of time before the Civil War began, had many opportunities to find out, yes, what she said was exactly right. She did see it in vision. It was God that revealed it to her. And then when she made this specific prediction that there would be people in that church that would lose loved ones, we find that 5 families experienced that. One other one, here's a prediction she made in a manuscript 114, 1902. Not long hence, these cities will suffer under the judgments of God. San Francisco and Oakland are becoming as Sodom and Gomorrah, and the Lord will visit them in wrath. So now if we don't have some big disaster that takes place in San Francisco, she's a false prophet. But on April 18, 1906, 4 years later, and here's an account from the Collier's magazine of that earthquake. According to Collier's magazine, 490 city blocks were destroyed. Between 225,000 and 256,000 were left homeless. Between 452 and 498 died in the cataclysm, and 1,500 were injured. Property was destroyed at the rate of $1 million every 10 minutes. While the earthquake caused considerable damage, a far greater devastation was wrought by the fire, which at times burned with blast furnace heat, ranging up to 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. This is an indicator that God is involved here when things of an unusual character take place. I read an account of the fires at Battle Creek. You may be aware that the Review and Herald publishing house was burned, and also the sanitarium was burned. And the firemen said, these Adventist fires are different. When we put the water on, it's like we're putting gasoline on the fire. And so, it was obviously a judgment from God to burn those two buildings. And, the lesson was learned for quite a while, but I'm afraid the lesson has been lost today in regard to why God burned those buildings down. During the sweeping blaze that followed the quake, many of the residents of San Francisco thought that the end of the world had come. Isn't that interesting? That God helped them to get the message. This is a warning. This is close to the end of time. And the people will realize, wow, is this the end of the world? Rumors, tidings of catastrophe flew up and down the lines. Now, not all these things were true, but these were the rumors that were flying around America. Chicago was in flames. A tidal wave had engulfed Seattle. New York had toppled into the sea. Confusion and chaos were besetting the world. San Francisco's fate was merely a tick of the clock of doomsday. So people really got scared all over, thinking that maybe these things are all true. But the San Francisco earthquake was true, and it was a judgment from God. Again, we look at S.N. Haskell in the fourth volume of the Ellen White biography, page 68. He said, before we began, we always made this statement that if they could ever find a line in the testimonies giving a prophecy or prediction which should be fulfilled and which had not been fulfilled, I would give up the testimonies. And after many years of doing that, he could say, there I will stand today, so I believe the testimonies. Now maybe you've heard of some of the questions that have arisen. For instance, Ellen White made a statement to an audience that some of the people standing there would see Jesus come. Some would die, and some would see Jesus come. But you'll notice he put a phrase in there that's very important. A prophecy or prediction which should be fulfilled. You see, we have in the Bible evidence of conditional prophecy. A conditional prophecy is something that is based on what people do. Now, God always offers good to us first. And so he said, for instance, to the Israelites, I will never give you up. But did he give them up? Yes. He was forced to give them up because they wouldn't do what he asked them to do. And so you can't take a conditional prophecy that's based on what people do and condemn the prophet. But then, of course, there are other prophecies that are not conditional on what people do. For instance, the birth of Jesus was not dependent on what anybody would do. And the Bible says he came exactly on time at the very moment that it was predicted he would come. And so we do have to make that evaluation of whether it's a prophecy depending on what they do. And another good one is the prophecy given to Jonah that Nineveh would be destroyed in 40 days. And he thought, God is so merciful, I don't want to give that message. And so he refused for a time, but finally God helped him to get in the mood to go and give the message. And sure enough, it happened just like Jonah thought. The city was not destroyed in 40 days. But the reason is that the people repented. And so God didn't have to destroy the city. Now later he did destroy it because they went back to their evil deeds. But it was postponed, so the threatenings of God, if people listen and they repent and turn around, he does not deliver the punishment that he said he would. Or if he promises blessings and they don't live according to his word, he can't give them the blessings. And so that we have to make allowances for that. But other than that, the prophecies of the prophet must come to pass if it's the time for them to come. Some are still future as well. Well,